Hello, I'm Dave Carsten, and you're here to listen and watch Empathy, Prayer, and Patient Care. So you may ask, who am I? I'm Dave Carsten. I'm a biochemist, dentist, anesthesiologist. I am a commissioner on the Dental Quality Assurance Commission for the state of Washington, and I'm also on the ADA steering committee for the DL-OSCE, which is our new examination for licensure of dentists. So my interest in empathy and patient care and prayer really started quite some time ago when I was in the Boy Scouts. I had an opportunity to speak in front of people, but one of the things in the Scouts that we talked about was having empathy for other people and the importance of that. And then through the Scouts, I got more and more into giving speeches, and in fact, when I was in high school, I was selected to be the faculty speaker at our commencement ceremony and got a standing ovation. And one of the key things that my dad taught me, because he coached me on that speech, was that I had to have empathy for the audience and try to understand how they were thinking and how they were responding. So when I went to dental school and graduated, we weren't really taught necessarily how to work with patients so much as we were taught to do clinical dentistry. So in the process of getting into a practice, it became very important for me to understand how patients behaved, but even more important for somebody going into business was to understand the behavior of my employees and to be able to deal with them. So with that, it became important to me to gather enough information and training to be able to work with people well. And so in the process of that, I got to know that people that go to the dentist oftentimes are very scared, and they had good reasons for being scared, things that happened to them. And so through that, I got interested in anesthesia, and then eventually went into a residency and learned how to do general anesthesia, dealing with people that had big problems. So in the process of being in New York City in that anesthesia residency, I also became a Eucharistic minister and spent time with people in the hospital that were ill or sometimes desperately ill or even dying. And I found that I was able to deal with that, and I want to let you know how I went through that process and how you might also be able to work with people that are in desperate situations. Also, in the process of doing this learning, I want to make sure that we use critical thinking, that we carefully look at the literature and see what's going on, what do we really know, and what do we not know. Let me give the example of Ileana Van Zandt. So Ileana was a star. She was on Oprah Winfrey. Everything was working for her. She was a relationship expert. And she thought that from there, perhaps she could go on and have her own show. But within a few months of doing that, her life fell apart. And in fact, she even thought about committing suicide. And what she says now is that the only thing that kept her from suicide was her prayer relationship with her Creator. And in fact, when she talks about it, she said that the important, essential things seemed to be that intimate connection that she had and the feeling of support. And when she did pray, it was usually either help me or thank you, is what she prayed about. In the Christian tradition, prayer can take many different forms. It can be conversational prayer, like, God help us, or meditative prayer. That might take the form, say, of a rosary. Or it could be ritual prayer. For instance, Our Father who art in heaven. And also there's a fourth kind of prayer called intercessory prayer, where it can be prayer from a distance. for perhaps people you don't know. So let's talk about meditative prayer first. That's what's been studied the most in science. So for Buddhists, prayer is meditation. For Catholics, it's the rosary. For Jews, it's called davening. For Protestants, it's centering prayer. So if we look at a study that was done in 2007, prayer as medicine, how much have we learned? It's broken down into what happens when you say a prayer. So the first thing that happens is a relaxation response. Also, they broke it down into how prayer can be what we call a placebo. And don't take placebo as something artificial. It's a real thing. It's tapping into the healing system of your body. Also, prayers can elicit positive emotions. And prayers, as Van Zandt said, can be relational. So let's do a scientific experiment with me. This is a ritual prayer. So what we're going to do is we're going to recite the 23rd Psalm. I have a connection to this because it was a favorite of my mother. So recite it with me. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, thy comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Amen. So, I said that was a scientific experiment. Did that change your experience of that prayer? So you may say yes, you may say no, but what our experience in a scientific setting says is that it did change it. I wanted to point that out. So one of our main explorers of the science of prayer says that trying to study prayer as a scientific exploration makes for bad science and bad religion. The problem with studying religion scientifically is that you do violence to the phenomenon. That's Dr. Richard Sloan, who talked about that. He's from Columbia University and also author of a book talking about the science of studying prayer. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think we can study prayer and we can learn some things from it. Herbert Benson, MD of Harvard, who has studied prayer for more than 30 years, he's mostly focused on meditative prayer and the Buddhist tradition in particular. So all forms of prayer can evoke a relaxation response, quells stress, quiets the body, promotes healing. It decreases sympathetic tone. So let's do an experiment. What I'd like you to do is breathe in, and then purse your lips and breathe out slowly to a count of 5. And I'd like you to repeat that. Breathe in, breathe out to a count of 5. Now this is called a Valsalva maneuver, so you continue to do that. And what that will do is it'll slow your heartbeat. And in fact, it will alter the tone of your vagus nerve. And it will calm your blood pressure, it'll calm your body by doing that simple thing. And in fact, if you visited a hospital, perhaps you will have noticed that many patients are given what we call an incentive spirometer that they blow into. It does the same thing. Now, not only does it inflate their lungs and helps them get healthier, it also calms them and is healing in itself. So, most prayer focuses on repetition. The focus is on the sounds and the words, and therein lies the entry to the process. So if we look at the MRI scans, and if we combine that information with information that was collected at the University of Pennsylvania in their various studies, you get a picture of a complex brain activity when people engage in prayer. So as an individual goes deeper and deeper into concentration, there will be intense activity in the parietal lobe circuits in that part of the brain towards the back. Then after that, there's a quietude that falls over the entire brain. At the same time, the frontal and temporal lobe circuits become disengaged. Then the mind-body connection starts to dissolve. The limbic system, that's the system deep in the brain that puts emotional tags on experiences or objects, it becomes activated. It also, by the way, regulates blood pressure, heartbeat, the autonomic nervous system, the metabolism, and more. So the result is that many people get a sense of awe and quiet when they're engaged in prayer. And it actually has a positive, healthy effect on their body. The body becomes more relaxed. Physical activity becomes more evenly regulated. So when this happens, are we communicating with a higher being? Or is it simply the brain engaging? Well, to give you an answer to that, that's very subjective. That's something that you'll have to answer. If you're religious, it's God-given. If you're not, it's strictly from the brain, and there's some kind of evolutionary advantage. You decide. So what about an intercessory prayer? That's prayer at a distance. Well, there have been some interesting studies done on that, and they date back more than 100 years. So one of the commentators on that was C.S. Lewis, who concluded that we cannot scientifically test intercessory prayer. Why? Why can't we? Well, the problem has to do with intention. If you're engaging in intercessory prayer as a scientific experiment, how can you mask your intention that it is a scientific experiment? So in fact, I think the quote before that you're doing violence to religion and science probably is true in that case. Because you can't hide your intention. It is what it is. So, testing prayer and praying are foundationally different. The experiment, C.S. Lewis concluded, is an impossibility. And if you consider that at Gethsemane, the holiest of all petitioners, prayed 3 times for that cup to be removed from him, and that prayer was not answered. So, I think it's the height of hubris to think that we can control our Creator's behavior. So let me talk about something a little bit different. I wanted to give an example of the tetralogy of flow, and that's a heart defect that happens congenitally. So I know some people, being in anesthesia, I encounter people that have tetralogy of flow, and I have some friends and acquaintances that have also had heart defects. So it's risky. And in fact, some of you may know that Jimmy Kimmel's son was born with a heart defect, tetralogy of flow, and it had to be corrected. I have a friend that has a child. His name is Rowan, And he had what's called a patent foramen ovale, a leak through the different sides of his heart that he was born with. They both had to have surgery. They both made it. I don't know that either family is particularly religious or engaged in prayer, but they made it. Then I also know a family, the daughter has tetralogy of flow, and they're very religious Lutherans. They pray frequently and with authenticity, and their daughter did fine through her surgery as well. So what do we learn from that? Well, when you're looking at the scientific study, you have to think critically. And the truth is neither right nor left, neither up nor down. It is what it is. One of the things that I'd like you to think about is how can we be successful healthcare providers? Well, the 7 habits, if we want to use a Stephen Covey thing, the 7 habits of successful healthcare providers in working with patients starts with being reflective, perhaps even meditative, to know yourself well, to have hope and give hope, to have compassion, to be curious about other people, to be a good communicator, and to have discretion. One of the big issues that we have in studying prayer or anything is confirmation bias. That if we hear something that agrees with our own feelings, our own wishes, we tend to think that that must be true. And it's something that we have to fight in science all the time. So there are many ways that we can fool ourselves. Our cognitive processes don't necessarily always lead us to the truth. So we have to be aware of that, and especially when we're looking at something as emotionally charged as prayer and religion. So let me give you an example that's outside of this. Okay. On the slide that I'm showing right now, it says toast causes cancer. Now you may wonder about that. Does it really cause cancer? Well, the fact is that back in 2002, there was a Swedish scientific group that was looking at their gingerbread at lunch, and they saw that there was brown on the bread, and they wondered, I think it probably was Sven and Oli, and they're saying, what's this brown stuff? And they didn't know. So they studied it, and they found out that what it contained was acrylamide. And in fact, as they started to test more and more food, they realized that anything that had asparagine and a reducing sugar in it, a little bit of temperature, would create acrylamide. Well, as I said, I have a background in biochemistry, and one of the things that I used to work with in chemistry was polyacrylamide gels, and we were always taught to be very careful with acrylamide because that could cause cancer, and it could damage your nervous system and do all kinds of havoc on your health. And to find out that it's in food, that's hard to take. Well, what they did is they published that in 2003 in Sweden at first, and the whole country of Sweden stopped eating bread for 4 days, and then they went back. And the thing is, presenting something like that, it's hard because people don't want to believe it. And yet, you can still find that information on the FDA site, NIH, and the Center for Disease Control, because it didn't make it any less true. So if you want to know what would prevent you from creating acrylamide, mostly it has to do with the temperature that food's cooked. If you can keep the temperature below 248 degrees Fahrenheit, so in other words, if you steam or boil things, you'll probably be okay. You can find more information on cancer.gov, the FDA, and the CDC. And if you're still doubting this, there are companies that are producing products that are low acrylamide. In fact, J.R. Simplot did a genetically modified potato that produces less acrylamide because they know it's a big deal. And that they're thinking that it might be an advantage for them to have a product like that someday. Unfortunately, some of the products that create the most acrylamide are things like teething biscuits and graham crackers. Yeah, sad. Also, interestingly, cigarettes have a fair bit of acrylamide because of the burning temperatures and the fact that American cigarettes usually have sugar in them. It was pointed out to me that Japanese cigarettes do not have sugar added. They're probably a little harsher, but the rate of cancer is much lower in Japan amongst smokers. So perhaps that has something to do with it. You want to be careful, most careful, of French fries, potato chips, especially sweet potato chips and breakfast cereals. So probably you're not going to want to hear what I just said. You're not going to want to believe that. It probably won't play into your own biases and what's in the media, but it doesn't make it any less true. So I'll tell you anyway. One of the things that they do at the National Institute of Health is they look for unpublished data, studies that have been made and perhaps, for whatever reason, didn't show up in the literature. And there was a recent one that was found. It was from more than 40 years ago. In the late 70s, this research was done. They spent millions of dollars. They were trying to prove that polyunsaturated fat was an advantage over saturated fat. And so they had nearly 10,000 people in this study. They were people in institutions, so they could control what they ate. Usually, almost any other study you look at, you can't control what people really eat. So in this study, they could control it. And what they discovered is that it proved the opposite of their hypothesis, that the saturated fat seemed to be fine, and the unsaturated fat was not. Well, that completely went against anything that anybody wanted to believe at the time. So what happened to the data? Wasn't published. Even though it was a gold standard study in the late 70s. And our nutrition literature and recommendations from the government marched on without that important piece of information. Now there, I think we have to have empathy for those scientists. They didn't want to be criticized or discredited. They were scared of publishing that data because it went against the confirmation bias of the rest of the country. And that way, it's sad that we've gone so long with false information. So when we look at studies regarding prayer, or regarding anything, we have to consider, how do we look at this? Can we think about it critically? And now with the advent of Google, and people can be their own expert, it's very easy to engage in confirmation bias. And anytime an expert makes a mistake, it makes it worse, because that plays into our bias that they don't know any better than we do. And it's led to this sense that what the experts say doesn't matter. You know, they're good. Their guess is as good as mine. But in fact, that's not true. What it's even led to is things like donut burgers, where people will have 2 donuts, bacon, cheese, and a burger, 2,000 calories, and think it's okay. Or think that since the experts don't seem to know any better, what's the difference? It's troubling. So empathy is a part of politics, it's a part of science, it's a part of life, and it can be used for good or evil. So there are empathetic challenges in places like hospitals. I've certainly had my own. I can remember when I was working with a 62-year-old female, an uncontrolled diabetic, and when I went into that room to pre-op her because she was going to have surgery for amputations the next day, she just really didn't understand how she'd gotten into that situation. And yet, you have to try to have empathy for that person to understand how could they have been led in that direction? Why did they ignore their feet turning black? Because it didn't hurt? Because they were scared? Because something had happened to them in the past? Or I also remember the father of a 2-year-old with a head injury who had said the child had fallen off a bench, and we had her in the OR, and we could not do anything for her. And in fact, she died, and when we found out later that she'd actually fallen from a second-story window, it's hard to have empathy for that father. Or the 32-year-old female that had a gastric bypass when she weighed 400 pounds, and when I saw her, she weighed 460. It is possible to overcome those things. It's hard for me to hear people say disparaging things when we don't try to understand. Empathy can be hard. Trying to understand other people can be difficult. One of the big problems that we have in medicine and in dentistry is empathy exhaustion, compassion collapse. And in fact, oftentimes, healthcare providers spend so much time with patients and not really understanding their problems, and the patients being demanding, controlling, hard to deal with. They feel like after a few years, or perhaps many years, they feel like they're in hell, and they're tired of it. And I'm going to say that a lot of it has to do with how the practitioner thinks and how they work with those patients. It has to do with their empathy, their understanding of that situation. A lack of empathy is very common. Patient complaint that their physician doesn't really try to understand or have any feel for how they feel. So why is empathy so lacking in so much of healthcare? Well, part of it went back to a guy named Osler. Back in the late 1800s, he gave a speech, a valid Victorian address at Harvard. And he talked about being imperturbable and how a physician should not be influenced by the misfortune of their patient. They should be able to be cold and clinical so that they can make a better decision. And in fact, he continued to lecture on that for more than 50 years. And that convinced much of medicine that that's the approach we should take. And it really wasn't until perhaps 1958 when Charles Ehring talked about how perhaps empathy should be something that's considered. But still, he was talking about how a physician, and I'm going to apply this to a dentist as well, should be detached yet interested. And in fact, Ehring went on to say that the happy medical practice is to remain unencumbered by patients' problems. So what barriers do we have to being empathetic with patients? Some of these barriers are a wish to stay invulnerable. We don't want to expose ourselves. We prize perfectionism. We don't want to admit that we could possibly make a mistake. We're tied to outcomes. Many of us are. We want certain things to happen for patients, and we want them to take on certain behaviors. And in fact, we project our personal outcomes on patients. And it causes problems because that's not necessarily the patient's outcome. This has gotten to be such a problem for doctors that there are several books now talking about how doctors feel about dealing with patients and how it's been a burden on them. And it's created a wish to change the situation. So in 2003, Jody Halpern published a paper talking about physicians' emotional attunement greatly serves the goal of understanding patients' emotions. And in fact, that there are important implications for teaching empathy in getting good patient outcomes. What they found is that physicians are more effective healers and enjoy being with patients a lot more when they actually engage in empathy. And in fact, that's the opposite of what people thought. So because of those studies and the studies of others, in 2012, medicine decided that they needed to change. Empathy was too important because essentially you get good outcomes for nothing. It doesn't require a special piece of equipment or medicine, but it's the relationship of the practitioner to the patient. So in 2012 they made the decision, and in 2015 they changed the examination to become a physician, the MCAT. Spring of 2015 was the first time they had checked half the questions and focused that half on trying to select people that would engage in critical thinking and were inherently more empathetic. They're trying to select out the people that, by research, would be the best as healers. So will it choose the scientist, humanist, spiritual doctor that we're hoping? Well, we'll see, but it's probably going to be 8 or 10 years before we really see what happens with that. But I know people are in earnest. They're trying to make that happen. And patients are hoping for someone who will listen and understand them.
There's new ground to be broken and new action to be taken.
It does require, however, our best effort and to believe in ourselves.
We cannot slip backwards. We must go forward together.
I believe opportunity looks a lot like hard work.
That special spirit that says, give me a challenge and I'll meet it with joy.
No matter what you're going through, keep going.
What are we waiting for? We can do something right now.
To go places we've never gone before, we've got to do things we've never done before.
Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. That challenge is one that we're willing to accept, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
Lift up your heart, all will come right. Out of the depths of sorrow and of sacrifice will be born again the glory of mankind.
So the point of that commercial is that words have power. Words change everything. Impossible, grumpy, ignorant, wimpy, hypersensitive. Hopeful words change everything. Youthful, honest, kind, energetic. As you heard, we must act bolder, reach deeper, rethink everything. You need to model empathetic communication. It's important with the people that you work with. If you want to work well with others, you need to model empathetic communication. So how do we learn empathy? Empathy is in our own wiring. It also is a talent, and it's also a skill. So about 98 to 96% of us have some empathic ability. There are people that don't, but almost all of us do. Now, as you might imagine, the psychopaths that don't have that connection, they can be those people that are cool in a crisis, as long as they follow the rules and don't kill us. And generally, they don't. But they sometimes become CEOs and maybe people we don't like, but they can become very successful. So what does a psychopath want? They want to win. So we can learn to improve our empathy, that natural empathy that's built into us, by example, watching others behave, by performing in front of a crowd. Because when you perform in front of a crowd, especially with other people, or watching that crowd, and you're responding to them, you're gaining empathy, you're learning. You can also learn more about empathy by reading books that engage in deep character analysis. You're inside the heads of those characters. That helps you learn empathy. And by movies. There are actually some good examples. Spartacus. If you've watched Spartacus, do you remember the scene when the Romans say, "Slaves you were and slaves you remain, but you will be spared the terrible penalty of crucifixion, with the single condition that you identify the body or the living person of the slave named Spartacus." And what did those slaves do? "I'm Spartacus, I'm Spartacus, I'm Spartacus." So it was more than a person, it was an idea. Or Mr. Holland's Opus. Remember the scene when the girl was so frustrated about playing the clarinet and she felt she couldn't succeed, and he took the time to get into her head and help her relax and help her play. And then do you remember in the final scene what had happened with her? She became the governor of the state because of his interaction. Or in Men of Honor, where a disabled man is required to walk 12 steps to prove that he can be a Navy diver. And he performed the task because of mentoring with a coach. Mentoring is essential to bring out the best in people. So how does this empathy work? It works because we have neurons called mirror neurons. They're with us. They're built into us. So we have to engage them. So this happens in places in your brain called the premotor cortex, supplementary motor area, primary somatosensory cortex. I don't need to go into all those little spots. But what we need to do is let's engage them. So in fact, let's do that, because by engaging those neurons, that's how we learn language, we learn physical actions, we learn theory of mind. That's how a child, when they're maybe 4 or 5, they start to really figure out, if I do this, this is what's going to happen. These are the behaviors that other people are going to exhibit. This is what that other person is going to do in a certain situation. They start learning to predict what other people are going to do. That's theory of mind. And those skills also help them predict how another person is going to feel. So let's try a little mirroring experiment. So I want everybody to stand up. And if you're by yourself, just mirror with me. So I'm going to make a motion, and I want you to mirror me. Do the same thing. So when I move, like that, think you probably did that successfully. And so what that tells you, if you were able to copy what I did, that tells you that you're able to pay attention. It engaged mirror neurons that are not the same as the ones that give you emotional empathy. They're close by, but it tells me that you can pay attention, because that's the first step in empathy, is paying attention, not letting your mind run about, oh, what's happening in the next room, or what do I need to do in 10 minutes, but pay attention to the person that you're with. Pay attention. Many people, when they're with someone, they're not really listening to understand, they're listening to reply. And what I'm telling you is you need to listen to understand. You'll remember what they said, and you'll come up with an answer. You don't have to come up with that answer as they're talking. Wait until the end, because you want to hear the full answer that they have, or the full explanation that they have. So if you were to ask a patient a question, the average patient, how long do you think they'll talk? Average patient talks about 90 seconds. Unfortunately, physicians usually interrupt the patient in about 15, and they miss all that information. So the first step is paying attention. So then you can start to engage empathy. Empathy is understanding how a person feels. Now, sometimes we get this confused with sympathy. Sympathy is how you feel about that situation. And in fact, these two things happen in a different spot in your brain. So when you're working with empathy and listening to that person describe something, you're listening for understanding. But if you start to feel your own emotions start to engage, that's sympathy. And in fact, those neurons turn off each other. So if you're listening for understanding, you're not going to engage in sympathy. You're going to engage in understanding. If you start to engage your emotion, you're thinking about yourself. And that's the difference. So, is it a bad thing to have sympathy? No, it's not a bad thing. But it's more important that you understand what that patient is going through and what they're thinking. Or the person in front of you. It doesn't have to be a patient. It could be anyone. It could be your son or daughter, or your wife, or your husband. You listen for understanding. Now, what does the sympathy part do when your emotion engages? That emotion allows you to make a decision so that you can move to feeling compassion, wanting to help that person if they're in a situation that needs help or needs some kind of solution. So the important takeaway in this little piece is that sympathy and empathy are different. What do patients need? They need understanding. They don't really need us to cry with them. They need understanding. Is it okay to have some sympathy? Absolutely. It is okay. But understand the process in your own mind. Once you understand what's going on, you will have some power over it. And you can know that you can engage that power when you're in those situations. And in fact, those are the situations where I know as part of the spiritual care team at a hospital, I can go into a room where perhaps the patient is dying, and I don't have to engage my emotions so much. So, in fact, what I do is before I walk in there, I have a little meditation for myself, is that I'm here to help. I'm here to be with them, to do whatever I can. This is not about me. And just that simple meditation helps me deal with that situation. If you think about it, shouldn't we feel uplifted by being with people that are in a desperate situation? Shouldn't we feel good about being there to be helpful, to make them feel listened to or cared for? I think that's the way I feel. I used to be afraid of being with people that were dying, or people that were in distress. Not anymore, or pretty rarely. So if you're wanting to look at some of the studies about empathy in healthcare providers, probably the best place to look is with a scientist named Dr. Mohammad Reza Hojat from Jefferson Medical College. What he did, along with his students and other professors, is that they created a test for empathy where they can track empathy. Because what we know is that when students enter professional school, they're at their highest level of empathy. And because what has been done with training in past years, as they progress through their training, their empathy gets lower and lower and lower. And that's not what we want. Has that been proven? It's been validated many, many times. Hundreds of papers to show that that's exactly what happens. It's true for physicians, and it's true for dentists and other healthcare providers. So as I said, when your emotion engages, it allows you to make a decision to move to compassion. Compassion is the wish to relieve suffering of another. Doesn't mean you're going to do something. And in fact, compassion is empty unless it moves you to action. And that action would be described as loving kindness. We can see those things happening in different parts of the brain. We're built for it. We're built to do that. We're built to work in groups, in relationship with other people. It's important to have those relationships, and it's important, if we're healers, to have healing relationships with people. And remember that when you're with a person, be mindful, be present with them, be there to listen, have empathy, be okay with having sympathy, feeling something, recognizing a situation, having an emotion, but realize really you're trying for understanding. Sympathy is about you. Empathy is about that person. There was an interesting study at Harvard, spring of 2014, a white paper, and what they looked at is placebo effect. And some people think that placebo effect is some kind of artificial thing, and it really isn't. It's engaging your own systems that are within your own body. So I looked at some of the different aspects of this white paper, and I pulled out a couple that I thought were really interesting. So there was one where they treated people with asthma. And what they did is they gave them fake albuterol. Fake albuterol. They told them it was fake albuterol, but they presented it in a very empathetic way, that this is fake albuterol, but I've seen people get well with this. I want you to get well. And they did as well as they did with the real drug. It's remarkable. They had another one, treating IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, very difficult disease to treat. And they gave them sugar pills. They told them they were sugar pills. But they gave them those sugar pills in, these are sugar pills, but I want you to get better, and I've seen people get better. Take these. They did better than they did with the real drugs. And it's because of that empathetic relationship. Studies like this are very convincing. And they're done by very reputable places like Harvard and Johns Hopkins. So we know that there's truth in what they're saying. So Hojat built this thing called the Jefferson Scale of Empathy so that they can look at what happens with the healthcare providers over time. And as I said, you can see in these slides, it's been validated many, many, many times. So we know it's not made up. So training in the last 100 years has served to degrade empathy and created this situation of clinical inattention, when in fact we need to have clinical attention. mindfulness. That's the start. As I mentioned, you can use theater, speaking in front of people, playing music, to build your empathy, because you're responding to the people that you're playing or acting with, and you're responding to the crowd. That builds that empathy. It strengthens it in you. Pay attention. What we've seen is that doctors that have engaged in mindfulness training and empathy training have far less burnout. They do better with their patients are happier and get better outcomes. Not surprising, really, not surprising at all. In fact, that was a study done at Wake Forest in 2013. Pay attention. Is this a new idea? Frankly, it isn't. These are ideas that were talked about by Hippocrates 2,500 years ago, Galen 1,800 years ago, Maimonides 800 years ago. They knew. So here, more recently, the Dalai Lama challenged the scientific community. Show me. You know, I don't know if you've heard the Dalai Lama speak, but he says, tell me if this is true. If it is true, great. If it is not, oh well. He wanted them to show, is it true what the Tibetan Buddhists have been saying about meditation and prayer? All this 2,500 years, is it true? And you know what they found out? It was published in Scientific American just a couple of years ago. By golly, they're right. It's true. And in fact, I had the advantage of working with Geshe-la Tashi, who used to be the Dalai Lama's ambassador to Mongolia. And he worked with me on trying to get a better understanding of how meditation, compassion, sympathy, empathy worked. It was quite fun talking with him and, in fact, teaching with him. One of the things that he suggested, and it's very simple, is that meditation is not a difficult thing. It's not about learning to clear your mind necessarily. That's one way to practice. But really what it's about is repeating over and over the kinds of thoughts or behaviors that you want to exhibit. So what he does every morning when he wakes up is he wakes up and he says, I want to relieve the suffering of all sentient beings. That is what he says every single morning of his life. He starts out that way, and that's what he tries to do. I think we could do something like that as well. Pay attention. Mindfulness takes practice. It's very easy to get in a situation where you're thinking about what's 2 rooms away. Don't do it. You don't have to. You'll make it there. Pay attention. Do it well. Whatever's in the room right now, be with them. Reinforce positives, the kinds of behaviors that you want to engage in more often, that you want to exhibit, that you want to think. Funny slide. Let me reiterate. Mindfulness, paying attention is the first step. Pay attention. Give that person you're with your full attention. Empathy is understanding. Trying to understand the way they're thinking, the way they're feeling. Understand also that sympathy is okay, but don't live there. If you're a healthcare provider, it's okay to have that bit of how do I feel, but focus on trying to understand the patient. Compassion. If you're a good person, you want to relieve the suffering. If you're a healthcare provider, I would hope you want to relieve the suffering of the people that you're with. And then actually do something. That's loving kindness. So what do? I try to pay attention. Since I've learned these things, I take greater effort to pay attention to people when I'm with them. I try to emphasize empathy, about listening for understanding and not living in how I feel about this situation so much. I think it's helped me to understand the organization of the brain. It has helped me to, just that realization has helped me to work with it better and feel better about it. I want to tune in to compassion. How can I relieve the suffering of other people and actually do something about it? So each profession has their own time pressures. What are the challenges for you to be empathetic? So realize that empathy can be exhibited in a 5-second exchange. It doesn't mean that you have to spend 20 minutes. It really doesn't. So Psychology Today, June 2014, there were 5 scientifically supported benefits of prayer. Prayer improves self-control. We've shown that people that engage in regular prayer do seem to have better self-control. Prayer seems to make people nicer. They're more compassionate to others. Prayer makes you more forgiving. Prayer also increases trust amongst people that pray together. Social prayer is a worthwhile activity. Prayer seems to offset negative health effects of stress. Remember what we talked about, the calming of the body when people engage in meditative prayer. It decreases sympathetic tone. Now, you can do it by vasovagal breathing as well. I think perhaps engaging in prayer might be a useful adjunct for many activities where maybe isn't so appropriate. So thinking about the welfare of others is a crucial component of receiving benefit. One of the big takeaways that I found in these studies of prayer is that, yes, people get benefit from someone praying for them, but if they pray for that other person back, they get a better benefit. They actually have an improved outcome. So that social aspect of relationship is very important in prayer and in making it more effective. In the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, they found that prayer improves self-control and executive function. That's especially important for people that have chronic pain. It can help them control their pain better. And it prevents self-control depletion, where they just lose it. So prayer will help center people that are having struggles. As I said, prayer has deep relational implications. It creates higher feelings of unity and trust in relationships, especially in intimate relationships. So there are some confounding factors when we study prayer. One of the problems in studying people that are religious compared to other people is they tend to be a little healthier. They smoke less, they drink less, they drink and drive less, and they get sick a little less often. So there are some issues that have to be separated out when studying prayer. Research underway right now. There's a researcher called Koenig who's at Johns Hopkins, and there's a study where 80 black women who have early stage breast cancer are involved. And they've already run the prototype study, so what they do is they connect them with 8 other women in their church, and they pray together because they want to see. The early study showed positive results. They did better. So they want to see, can we really show something more statistically significant by having more people in the study? So we should have some interesting results in another year or 2. Researcher named Krukov was also involved in a study that's ongoing. There's been a prototype study on heart disease in people that have angioplasties. And one of the problems with having an angioplasty, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but they thread a wire up through the femoral vein up into someone's heart, and they want to probably put a stent or clear out an artery. One of the problems with having those procedures is that they have to do them awake, and patients are very stressed. And if somebody's there praying with them, they become calmer. And in fact, they have a better outcome. So that's what the prototype studies have been showing. So they're doing a larger study on that to see if they can combine prayer and that intervention, people will have better outcomes. It seems they do. So one of the issues that we've found in studying prayer is especially is in intercessory prayer, where there have been a number of what we call Cochrane studies, where there's a big review of literature regarding that intercessory prayer. So in 2009, there was a big study on intercessory prayer, that's praying for people distant, and it showed didn't seem to do anything. There was also studies in 2006 and 2007 that also seemed to fail to produce any significant results. And in fact, there was a very expensive study that was sponsored by the John Templeton Foundation. And they spent more than $2.5 million on this study where they were studying intercessory prayer. And what they showed was that in their studies of 1,800 patients in 6 different hospitals, where these people were prayed for by prayer experts, like nuns and priests and people in various churches, they were told to pray in a specific way for a successful surgery, quick and healthy recovery, no complications. And in fact, what they found is that there was almost no difference. But in fact, in the group where they knew they were being prayed for, they did 8% worse. And in fact, the suggestion was, what they said in the study is they didn't want to suggest that people not pray, but perhaps they had given these patients performance anxiety. And removing that social aspect of the prayer seemed to degrade its power. So really, it's back to what C.S. Lewis said, is that with intercessory prayer, we really can't prove it. So I think we can leave it at that. So what are the takeaways? Prayer is relational. You need to pay attention to others and yourself. You need to have empathy. Healing is an important piece of prayer. It's important, if you can, to get the person that you're praying with to pray for you. They will do better. Intercessory prayers as an experiment, well, don't do that for me. It's difficult to prove that it works, but praying with people and having them pray for you in their presence definitely makes a difference. So I talked to a priest that prays and counsels people in hospitals often. And one of the things that he always does when he leaves a room is he says, "Thank you for your prayers for me," because he wants to make sure he emphasizes the social aspect, that relational aspect of the prayer.